In the commercial airline business, tiny costs can dictate the line between a profitable quarter and financial ruin. A famous 1980s story involving American Airlines encapsulates this desperate hunt for efficiency. Executives scouring balance sheets for ways to trim their operating budget without degrading the passenger experience realized that by removing exactly one olive from every first class salad, the company could save approximately $40,000 a year. The olive story reveals an underlying mindset. Airlines ruthlessly chase pennies, optimizing beverage cart weights, calculating catering volumes, swapping heavy paper manuals for digital tablets, and stripping paint off cargo containers to save ounces. They do this because the economics of running a commercial airline are notoriously brutal, and their biggest costs are inherently out of their direct control. Running an airline requires managing an equation where fixed costs are incredibly high and variable costs are deeply volatile. Airlines pay tens or hundreds of millions for fleets of aircraft. They negotiate long term contracts with unionized pilots, flight attendants, and mechanics. They pay exorbitant fees to lease international airport gates, plus landing fees every time a plane touches down. These baseline expenses are staggering and largely locked in place for years, regardless of whether flights are full or empty. Above these fixed expenses sits the ultimate variable cost, the single line item dictating financial survival more than any other: jet fuel. You can negotiate labor salaries for a decade. You can negotiate with Boeing for planes and airport authorities for gates, but you cannot negotiate with the global commodities market. By 2012, Delta Airlines faced a fuel problem that couldn't be solved by removing olives or tweaking baggage fees. In 2012 alone, Delta's total fuel bill reached an astonishing $12.25 billion. Fuel accounted for 36% of the airline's total operating expenses. More than a third of the money required to run one of the planet's largest airlines was poured into fuel tanks to be burned in the atmosphere. When a single commodity accounts for that much of your budget, even a microscopic percentage change in global prices can instantly wipe out a year of profitability. Faced with this existential vulnerability, Delta did something no other airline had ever done. They bought a real, physical, heavy industrial oil refinery. Delta didn't harbor a secret desire to become a petroleum conglomerate competing with ExxonMobil. They bought a refinery because they desperately wanted absolute control over the one raw input that could destroy their balance sheet overnight. To make sense of this multi-billion-dollar gamble, you must understand how fuel is refined, the terms of the energy market, and the unique supply chain logistics that keep commercial planes in the sky. Airplanes do not run on crude oil. When a rig pumps raw crude out of West Texas or the Middle East, that thick liquid is virtually useless to a modern jet engine. It must first be transported to a refinery, an incredibly complex chemical plant that acts as a giant boiling operation. By heating crude oil in a distillation column until it turns to vapor, refineries separate hydrocarbons, condensing at different temperatures into usable products through fractional distillation. The heaviest products become asphalt and cargo ship bunker fuel. The lightest become butane, propane, and everyday gasoline. Somewhere in the middle, you get diesel and kerosene. Jet fuel is essentially highly purified kerosene engineered to withstand the freezing temperatures of high-altitude flight. This process isn't free. Energy companies operating refineries charge a markup for turning useless crude into valuable jet fuel. In the energy industry, the economic gap between the cost of raw crude entering the plant and the wholesale price of refined products exiting the plant is universally known as the crack spread. The Energy Information Administration defines the crack spread as the direct difference between wholesale petroleum product prices and crude oil prices. This is a refinery's most important metric. When crude is cheap but gasoline and jet fuel are expensive, the crack spread is wide, and refiners make astronomical profits. When crude is expensive but demand for jet fuel drops, the spread is narrow, and refiners bleed cash. This dynamic creates a massive, largely hidden risk for airlines. For decades, airlines protected themselves through financial hedging, buying Wall Street paper contracts like futures or call options. These locked in a specific oil price months in advance. If a geopolitical conflict or natural disaster caused global oil prices to skyrocket, the financial institution paid the difference, neutralizing the increased cost at the physical pump. But there is a fatal structural flaw in how airlines hedge fuel, which Delta realized in 2012. Wall Street financial hedges are typically tied directly to crude oil benchmarks like Brent crude or West Texas Intermediate because the crude market is massive and highly liquid. But airlines buy jet fuel, not crude oil, and jet fuel prices do not always move in synchronization with crude oil. Between the crude market and the jet fuel market sits the oil refinery. The refinery's markup, the crack spread, fluctuates wildly based on its own supply and demand factors, completely independent of crude prices. Imagine a realistic scenario where global crude supply is stable and prices are low. An airline holding crude oil hedges feels secure, but then a devastating hurricane hits the U.S. Gulf Coast, forcing high-capacity refineries to shut down. Suddenly, there's a massive shortage of the machines that turn crude into jet fuel. Jet fuel supply plummets, and its price skyrockets. Refiners operating outside the hurricane zone make a fortune buying cheap crude and selling wildly expensive jet fuel. In this scenario, the airline's crude oil hedge is completely worthless. It only pays out if crude prices go up, but crude stayed flat. Meanwhile, their physical jet fuel bill doubles because their refiners are charging a massive premium. Historical examples prove this. There have been periods where jet fuel rose far faster than crude, specifically because refining margins jumped. The true risk to an airline isn't just oil going up, it's refining capacity getting tight. By 2012, Delta recognized this massive unhedged vulnerability. Their financial filings bluntly stated that fuel price volatility had a significant negative effect on results. Delta's CEO, Richard Anderson, realized the pain wasn't just the global cost of crude, it was the jet crack spread. This fast-growing, multi-billion-dollar cost simply couldn't be hedged effectively in the traditional financial marketplace, as there wasn't enough liquidity in jet fuel futures to cover an airline of Delta's size. Because Wall Street couldn't sell an effective insurance policy against the jet crack spread, Delta solved the problem by moving one step earlier in the physical supply chain. If refiners were extracting the profit and causing volatility, Delta would become a refiner. On April 30th, 2012, Delta shocked the aviation and energy industries by announcing its subsidiary, Monroe Energy, would acquire the Trainer Refinery complex from ConocoPhillips. Located near Philadelphia, Trainer boasted a crude processing capacity of 185,000 barrels per day and was uniquely configured to process light, low-sulfur crude, crucial for efficient aviation fuel production. ConocoPhillips was motivated to sell because East Coast refineries were in severe distress. Unlike Gulf Coast refineries with pipeline access to cheap domestic crude, East Coast facilities relied on expensive imported crude priced against the Brent benchmark. Their profit margins were squeezed, leading ConocoPhillips to idle Trainer and consider permanent closure. This distressed situation allowed Delta to acquire heavy industrial infrastructure for pennies on the dollar. Because closing the plant meant catastrophic job losses, Pennsylvania provided $30 million in government assistance to save the facility. Factoring in state aid, Monroe Energy's net investment to acquire the physical refinery was a mere $120 million. Delta committed an additional $100 million to upgrade internal infrastructure to maximize jet fuel production. Altogether, Delta's total capital commitment was roughly $220 million. While staggering to the average person, it's shockingly cheap in commercial aviation, roughly the list price of a single brand new wide-body passenger jet. Delta traded the cost of one airplane for ownership of a facility capable of processing nearly 200,000 barrels of oil a day. Delta's master plan relied heavily on geographical integration. The deal included access to critical pipelines aimed directly at moving jet fuel north from Pennsylvania into the Northeast Corridor, connecting the vital Delta hubs like LaGuardia and JFK. Delta was incredibly optimistic, projecting they would recover their entire $250 million investment within the very first year of operations. Perhaps their boldest claim was that Trainer's production, combined with strategic exchange agreements, would eventually provide a staggering 80% of Delta's domestic jet fuel needs. The business press and Wall Street were highly skeptical. Running a commercial airline is financially perilous. Refining crude oil is equally capital intensive and risky. Combining the two seemed like a recipe for a catastrophic management distraction. Experts warned that merchant refineries are prone to mechanical failures, volatile commodity markets, and intense regulations. Analysts argued an airline was blindly stepping outside its core competency, taking on billions in operational liability to chase a theoretical hedge. But these critics missed the fundamental architecture of Delta's strategy. Delta wasn't buying a standalone profit center or trying to diversify revenue. They were buying an insurance policy made of concrete, steel, pipes, and fractionating columns. They were executing a physical hedge. To grasp the genius and inherent risk of this physical hedge, return to the crack spread. An airline is the ultimate consumer of jet fuel, but the market begins with crude oil. Between the wellhead and the airplane, refining must occur. When refining capacity gets tight, that middle step becomes incredibly expensive. If an airline relies solely on paper contracts for crude, they remain entirely exposed to the refining margin. Delta publicly explained they bought the refinery to manage this exact exposure, projecting an overall reduction in fuel expense by $300 million annually. Think of Trainer as a counterbalance on a financial scale. When the crack spread widens, airlines suffer terrible financial damage. But a refinery earns significantly more money during periods of wide margins because it sells refined products at much higher prices relative to cheap crude. By owning the refinery, Delta created a perfect closed feedback loop. If the crack spread spikes and jet fuel becomes incredibly expensive, Delta the airline loses money, but Delta the refiner makes a fortune selling highly marked up fuel into that same high margin market. The refinery's profits cancel out the airline's increased fuel costs. Delta was physically insured against the margin. Delta's corporate accounting proves they view the refinery strictly as a fuel cost mitigation tool. Rather than hiding it as an unrelated side business, Delta explicitly includes Trainer's operating results directly within the aircraft fuel and related taxes line item on its income statement. If the refinery makes a profit, Delta subtracts that profit from its total airline fuel bill. However, buying a refinery immediately creates an incredibly complex logistical puzzle. An oil refinery is not a magic replicator. You cannot program the machines to produce 100% jet fuel. The rigid laws of chemistry dictate a broad spectrum of products. Even after Delta spent $100 million optimizing Trainer for aviation fuel, jet fuel still only made up a fraction of its daily production. The vast majority of the liquids flowing out were automotive gasoline, diesel, and home heating oil. Delta is an aviation company, not a roadside gas station chain or trucking fleet. Millions of barrels of gasoline and diesel were unavoidable byproducts. So what does an airline do with a tidal wave of automotive gasoline? Delta's answer was to turn its gasoline into a currency, relying on a complex, nationwide logistical network of physical commodity trading. Delta established intricate exchange agreements to trade Trainer's non-aviation refined products on the open commodities market. They traded with massive oil majors like Phillips 66 and British Petroleum. If Trainer produces a massive batch of gasoline, Monroe Energy trades it to BP, which operates a vast network of consumer gas stations across the East Coast. In exchange, BP delivers an equivalent financial value of refined jet fuel directly into Delta's aircraft at distant hubs like Atlanta, Detroit, and Los Angeles. This swap loop effectively leveraged a single East Coast asset into a nationwide fuel network. Gasoline became Delta's new corporate currency. Furthermore, recognizing they had zero initial expertise in global crude oil sourcing, Delta originally outsourced the supply chain. BP stepped in as their primary partner, taking responsibility for sourcing, purchasing, transporting, and physically delivering the raw crude. While Delta would later invest heavily in a rail facility to directly source its own domestic back-end crude, in those crucial early days, Delta provided the machinery, BP provided the raw materials and the swap network. Over the long term, this network proved remarkably effective. By 2022, Delta reported that jet fuel physically produced at Trainer, combined with fuel procured through exchanging gasoline and diesel, provided approximately 200,000 barrels of jet fuel daily, accounting for roughly 75% of their pre-pandemic domestic consumption. But while the swap network solved the chemical reality of refining, it didn't solve the regularity reality. Here, skeptical Wall Street analysts were proven painfully correct. Refining is an ugly, unstable, heavily regulated, and physically dangerous business requiring nonstop maintenance. Every few years, refineries undergo a turnaround, a massive planned maintenance event where sections are completely shut down, disassembled, inspected, and rebuilt. During a turnaround, the refinery produces zero fuel but costs hundreds of millions in contractor fees. Beyond mechanics lies the regulatory maze, primarily the Environmental Protection Agency's Renewable Fuel Standard, RFS, designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The RFS mandates blending renewable biofuels like corn based ethanol into the nation's transportation fuel supply. To track compliance, the EPA uses renewable identification numbers, RINs. Every time a gallon of renewable biofuel is produced, a RIN is generated. When a refiner physically blends that biofuel into traditional fossil fuel gasoline, the RIN is separated and submitted to the EPA to prove legal compliance. Herein lies the fatal structural flaw for Monroe Energy. Massive integrated oil companies like Chevron or ExxonMobil don't have a problem with RINs because they own vast retail blending facilities and thousands of gas stations. They physically blend the fuel, organically generating their own RINs. But Trainer is a standalone merchant refiner. Without downstream retail blending terminals, it physically cannot blend enough ethanol into gasoline to meet its quotas. To comply with the law, standalone refiners are forced into a secondary open financial market to purchase RIN credits from companies that have blended excess renewables. Traded openly, RIN prices fluctuate widely based on supply, demand, political decisions, agricultural outputs, and Wall Street speculation. Because Trainer is not a major ethanol blender, Monroe Energy is caught in a perpetual expensive deficit. Over the past decade, the secondary RIN market has been exceptionally volatile. In Delta's 2022 10K filing, the airline revealed the staggering cost of this regulatory burden. Because Monroe buys the majority of its IRNs on the secondary market, the refinery incurred an unbelievable $576 million in IRN compliance costs in a single fiscal year. Delta Airlines paid over $500 million in 1 year just to buy environmental compliance credits for a gasoline market they only participate in so they can trade for jet fuel. This massive financial liability has nothing to do with safely flying commercial airplanes and is a pure cost Delta would never have faced sticking to Wall Street paper hedges. This brutal reality highlights the ultimate duality of the Trainer refinery. It acts as a magnificent, powerful financial shield against the volatility of the jet fuel crack spread, but it simultaneously serves as a massive source of entirely new, highly unpredictable operational and regulatory risks. Delta didn't find a magic loophole to escape fuel prices. The global price of energy still fundamentally dictates their profitability. Instead, they changed exactly which parts of fuel pricing they were exposed to. They traded the risk of unhedgeable jet fuel refining margins for the operational risks of industrial maintenance, crude oil sourcing, and EPA compliance costs. As Delta clearly stated in its 2025 filings, Monroe Energy operates Trainer strictly as part of a strategy to mitigate the cost of the refining margin reflected in the price of jet fuel. So, after more than a decade of operation, did the strategy work? And how much does it matter to a company as massive as Delta? Examining a 4 year window from 2022 to 2025 provides a perfect illustration of how the refinery responds to global economic conditions. In 2022, global energy markets were thrown into absolute chaos. A post pandemic travel surge created massive demand, while geopolitical events disrupted supplies. Refining capacity was incredibly tight, and the crack spread skyrocketed to historic highs. This was the exact doomsday scenario Trainer was bought to protect against. In 2022, Delta reported the refinery generated operating revenue of $10.7 billion, resulting in an operating income of $777 million. The physical hedge performed spectacularly, printing nearly $1 billion precisely when the airline was facing punishingly high market prices for jet fuel. In this single year, the refinery more than paid for its original 2012 purchase price multiple times over. But the crack spread is volatile. In 2023, the market began to cool. Refinery operating revenue dropped to $7.5 billion dollars, and operating income fell to $385 million. This decrease was partly due to lower market pricing, but also due to a massive planned maintenance turnaround that shut the entire facility down for months, drastically cutting production and incurring massive capital costs. You cannot fly a plane without fuel, and you cannot run a refinery without shutting it down for heavy maintenance. By 2024, the refining market had largely normalized. The massive, historically wide crack spreads of the post pandemic era vanished. Consequently, Trainer's profitability plummeted. Operating revenue hit $7.7 billion, dollars, but operating income fell off a cliff to a mere $38 million. Dollars. The margin between breaking even and losing money had become razor thin, highlighting the difficulty of merchant refining during normal economic conditions. However, the cycle turned yet again in 2025. While revenue dipped slightly to $6.9 billion dollars due to lower overall energy pricing, operating income rebounded to $157 million. Industry refining margins had started to widen again, making jet fuel more expensive to refine, and Delta's physical hedge captured that widening margin as pure profit. These 4 years of financial data, from a high of $777 million to a low of $38 million, reveal two undeniable truths. First, the sheer scale of the operation is undeniable. When a subsidiary routinely generates $7 to $10 billion in operating revenue annually, it is a core pillar of Delta's fuel procurement strategy. Second, the refinery is not a flawless, consistent money machine. Its profits swing violently, entirely at the mercy of the crack spread, EPA compliance costs, and heavy industrial maintenance schedules. But judging the refinery solely on its standalone annual profit misses the forest for the trees. Delta doesn't need Trainer to be consistently amazing. They need the refinery to generate massive profits during the exact specific moments when the market jet fuel pricing is most painful to the airline. When the crack spread is tight and jet fuel is cheap, the refinery might only make $38 million, dollars, as in 2024. But Delta doesn't care, because its airline division is highly profitable buying incredibly cheap jet fuel on the open market. When the crack spread is massively wide and jet fuel is cripplingly expensive, the airline division is suffering, but the refinery steps up and generates $777 million, dollars, bailing out the airline's balance sheet. Delta proves this internal logic directly in its own accounting. In 2025, Delta reported a refinery segment financial impact of a negative $157 million. Because this is a negative number applied to an expense sheet, it means the refinery's profit actively reduced the airline's total fuel costs. Delta further reported this resulted in a 4-cent impact on its average fuel price per gallon. That 4-cent reduction per gallon is the entire justification for the Trainer refinery. When an airline burns nearly 4 billion gallons of fuel in a single year, those 4 cents translate into roughly $160 million in direct savings. The refinery actively reduces the effective price Delta pays to fly its planes, giving them a structural cost advantage over competitors. Crucially, Delta legally references the actual real-world market index for the primary delivery location, the New York Harbor Petroleum Trading Hub, when pricing the transfer of jet fuel from Trainer to airline. This proves Delta isn't just pretending their fuel is magically cheap. They forced their refinery to compete against the global commodities market. If it cannot produce fuel cheaper than Delta could buy it at New York Harbor, it does not generate value. Looking back at 2012, the debate over whether Delta's acquisition was corporate insanity or visionary genius remains mixed. It was undeniably risky, violently pushing an airline entirely out of its depth. Executives used to managing baggage logistics had to suddenly manage fluid catalytic cracking units and EPA renewable fuel standards. The hundreds of millions paid in IRN costs represent the unpredictable dangers of entering a completely foreign industry. To this day, Delta remains the only major airline to vertically integrate backward into physical oil refining. Other airlines decided that traditional Wall Street paper hedges, despite their flaws, were safer than owning a chemical plant. But simultaneously, it was a highly calculated strategic maneuver attacking the single most dangerous, unpredictable component of their highest variable cost. While every airline is subject to crude oil prices, Only Delta realized the refining markup was a volatile variable Wall Street was unequipped to hedge. Delta took $220 million and bought a physical mechanism to fight back. Looking forward, the future of Delta's strategy can be mapped out in three highly predictable economic scenarios. In scenario one, global refining capacity exceeds demand and the crack spread stays narrow. The refinery generates billions in revenue but razor thin margins. The airline is highly profitable buying cheap jet fuel, and the refinery acts merely as a massive break even fuel provider. In scenario two, moderate supply constraints push refining margins slightly higher. The physical hedge works exactly as intended, generating healthy profits that reliably shave pennies off every gallon Delta burns, securing a structural cost advantage. Ultimately, the story of how Delta Airlines accidentally became an oil company is a fundamental lesson in corporate control. Faced with a $12 billion problem, Delta identified the single biggest vulnerability in a chaotic supply chain and chose extreme vertical integration. They transformed an uncontrollable financial risk out of the ethereal, unpredictable world of Wall Street paper contracts, turning it into a tangible, physical form they could actively manage and hedge with real world industrial operations.